It's almost 5 weeks now, so it's been quite a while. It's quite a long time. As you know, we are a big fan of Beatrix Potter, and recently I've read that a lot of Beatrix's tales were actually inspired by her own pets. So I was actually wondering whether she had a talking rabbit called Peter. Who knows? Well, I guess we will never find out. Of course, Belle has written us another letter, and I'm very curious to see what she has to, what she's been up to last week and the last few days. So let's see. Ooh, today it's a beautiful golden letter. Okay. Dear keepers of the magical world of books, how are you, my dear friends? I, the bookshop fairy custodian of we bookworms, hope that you had a wonderful week with loads of books to read. Yet again, our fairy dust has given loads and loads of children magical reading powers, and we noticed that in the last couple of days, funny storybooks were especially popular. So I thought I would tell you about this week's disastrously hilarious and slightly scary events that unfolded in our lovely little fairy home. On Wednesday, after reading most of the books at We Bookworms, that's quite an accomplishment, my little brother Finn and I got incredibly bored. I had even finished my schoolwork. This week we had learned about Felicita Funky Star in our online lessons. She was the most famous fairy ballerina of all times. Finn and I had chased the grumpy gnomes up to the edge of the fairy garden and back, and we even went for a swim in the fairy pond, although the goldfish weren't very pleased about our diving attempts. Then Mummy had an incredible idea that would really help us to get rid of our boredom. Have you ever heard of the Great Fairy Cake Bake-Off? No? It is so very famous in the fairy world. So Mummy, Finn, Daddy and I did a little baking competition at home. It was such fun. The tastiest of all fairy cakes would win. Mummy and I decided to bake my favorite of all favorite cakes that my great granny had made for us hundreds and thousands of times. Oof, that's a lot of cake. Unicorn sponge fairy cake. You just need eggs, flour, sugar, milk, and then you also need a pinch of fairy dust, a tiny bit of fairy lemonade, 5 little unicorn flowers, a bit of sunshine, and 8 fresh raindrops. Unicorn sponge cake tastes of the most sweetest chocolate chip cookie that was dipped in honey, covered in bubblegum and cheese. Ugh, yuck. It's truly delicious. But what do you think is the most important ingredients of unicorn sponge fairy cake? Of course, it is the unicorn flower. Unicorn flowers only grow in front of unicorns on unicorn fields. So we went to our local unicorn Shimmershine, lovely name, who resides next to the fairy pond on a beautiful rainbow meadow. You have to ask unicorns nicely for permission to pluck unicorn flowers. Oh gracious, Shimmershine, may we pluck 5 flowers that grow in front of you? Shimmershine only speaks when necessary. Unicorn voices sound like soft lullabies and make you instantly fall asleep. So he only nodded in agreement. Unicorn flowers are rainbow colored and so sparkly that they are very hard to look at. Mummy and I needed to put on our special fairy sunglasses to be able to see them and carry them home. Next, we had to catch some sunshine in the fairy garden. You have to be very quick to be able to catch a bit of sunshine, especially in Ireland. But we were lucky. We caught an entire jar full. To get fresh raindrops, we had to fly up, up, up into the sky and ask a fresh cloud for a few raindrops. Easy peasy. Finally, we were ready to bake. Did I mention that Daddy and Finn baked windy dust cupcakes? Of course, they picked the easiest cupcakes that fairies can bake. They only had to collect old fairy dust and a tiny jar of wind. What a mess we made of the kitchen. There was some leftover sunshine on the floor. It was windy in one corner of the kitchen, and flour and eggshells were lying everywhere on the worktop. We also couldn't really check on our cakes in the oven because the unicorn flowers had made the cake batter look like an incredibly sparkly rainbow. We were literally blinded by our soon-to-be unicorn sponge cake. Once Daddy's and Finn's cake was in the oven, it erupted like a volcano and it became a lava-like substance. It poured out of the gaps of the oven and settled as a steaming puddle on the kitchen floor. I think we misread the recipe, Daddy said. His fairy wings were fluttering nervously as Mummy gave him an unimpressed stare. Next to our half-baked unicorn sponge cake that so far had not reacted to the heat in the oven, our half-baked unicorn sponge cake cracked open and several beautiful unicorn flowers sprung out of it. The flowers opened the oven door and danced around the kitchen on the slippery, windy dust cupcake batter. Our kitchen looked like a unicorn flower ice rink. We all had to put our special fairy sunglasses back on. The unicorn flowers were so sparkly. Of course, the leftover sunshine and wind from the recipe joined the madness and flew around the kitchen while singing silly songs. The wind was so fast that it almost created a tornado. But then Finn had a great idea. He opened the kitchen window and all ingredients jumped and flew out of the window. After a long stretch of silence, Daddy was the first to begin to laugh, and then all of us joined in. No one had won the competition, but our Great Fairy Bake-Off had been great fun. Mummy Daddy checked old Fairy Great Granny's recipe book and found out that we had used the wrong amount of eggs. Too many eggs can cause the cake's ingredients to come alive, Mummy translated from the cookbook or baking book that was written in Fairish. Fairies are incredibly lucky. We only need to snap our fingers and sing the tidy up song, and the kitchen was clean again in no time. What else happened? Oh no! I completely forgot to tell you about the adventure we had with Rupert, the Careless Cat, the most beautiful book in the world, 2 humans, and a precious ring. But I don't have any time left. Now, Finn and I will go on another expedition to the bottom of the fairy pond, where apparently a pirate treasure lies hidden. I've enclosed a lovely little book and loads of fairy dust to spread reading powers. Remember, together we can keep the world's books alive. Take care and see you next week. Belle, kiss, kiss. There you go. And I've got loads of fairy dust yet again. So, are you ready? Yay! There you go. And Belle has given us a lovely little tale. The tale of Mr. Jeremy Fisher by Beatrix Potter, of course. There you go. So, let's see. Once upon a time, there was a frog called Mr. Jeremy Fisher. He lived in a little damp house amongst the buttercups at the edge of a pond. The water was all slippy sloppy in the larder and in the big passage. But Mr. Jeremy liked getting his feet wet. Nobody ever scolded him, and he never caught a cold. He was quite pleased when he looked out and saw large drops of rain splashing in the pond. "I will get some worms and go fishing and catch a dish of minnows for my dinner," said Mr. Jeremy Fisher. "If I catch more than 5 fish, I will invite my friends Mr. Alderman, Ptolemy Tortoise, and Sir Isaac Newton. The Alderman, however, eats salad." Mr. Jeremy put on a mackintosh and a pair of shiny goloshes. He took his rod and basket and set off with enormous hops to the place where he kept his boat. The boat was round and green and very like the other lily leaves. It was tied to a water plant in the middle of the pond. Mr. Jeremy took a reed pole and pushed the boat out into open water. "I know a good place for minnows," said Mr. Jeremy Fisher. Mr. Jeremy stuck his pole into the mud and fastened his boat to it. Then he settled himself cross-legged and arranged his fishing tackle. He had the dearest little red float. His rod was a tough stalk of grass. His line was a fine long white horsehair, and he tied a little wriggling worm at the end. The rain trickled down his back, and for nearly an hour he stared at the float. "This is getting tiresome. I think I should like some lunch," said Mr. Jeremy Fisher. He punted back again amongst the water plants and took some lunch out of his basket. "I will eat a butterfly sandwich and wait till the shower is over," said Mr. Jeremy Fisher. A great big water beetle came up underneath the lily leaf and tweaked the toe of one of his galoshes. Mr. Jeremy crossed his legs up shorter, out of reach, and went on eating his sandwich. Once or twice something moved about with a rustle and a splash amongst the rushes at the side of the pond. "I trust that is not a rat." "Not a rat," said Mr. Jeremy Fisher. "I think I had better get away from here." Mr. Jeremy shoved the boat out again a little way and dropped in the bait. There was a bite almost directly. The float gave a tremendous bobbit. "A minnow, a minnow! I have him by the nose!" cried Mr. Jeremy Fisher, jerking up his rod. But what a horrible surprise! Instead of a smooth, fat minnow, Mr. Jeremy landed little Jack Sharp, the stickleback, covered with spines. The stickleback floundered about the boat, pricking and snapping until he was quite out of breath. Then he jumped back into the water. And a shoal of other little fishes put their heads out and laughed at Mr. Jeremy Fisher. And while Mr. Jeremy sat disconsolately on the edge of his boat, sucking his sore fingers and peering down into the water, a much worse thing happened. A really frightful thing it would have been if Mr. Jeremy had not been wearing a mackintosh. A great big enormous trout came up, flop, with a splash, and it seized Mr. Jeremy with a snap. "Ow, ow, ow!" And then it turned and dived down to the bottom of the pond. But the trout was so displeased with the taste of the mackintosh that in less than half a minute it spat him out again. And the only thing it swallowed was Mr. Jeremy's galoshes. Mr. Jeremy bounced up to the surface of the water like a cork and the bubbles out of a soda water bottle, and he swam with all his might to the edge of the pond. He scrambled out on the first bank he came to, and he hopped home across the meadow with his mackintosh all in tatters. "What a mercy that was not a pike," said Mr. Jeremy Fisher. "I have lost my rod and basket, but it does not much matter, for I am sure I should have never dared to go fishing again." He put some sticking plaster on his fingers, and his friends both came to dinner. He could not offer them fish, but he had something else in his larder. Sir Isaac Newton wore his black and gold waistcoat, and Mr. Alderman, Ptolemy Tortoise, brought a salad with him in a string bag. And instead of a nice dish of minnows, they had a roasted grasshopper with ladybird sauce. Ugh! Which frogs consider a beautiful treat. But I think it must have been nasty. Almost sounds a little bit like the unicorn fairy sponge cake. A bit weird, but a lovely little tale yet again. So thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope to see you next week again on Saturday at 11:30 a.m. Bye!